How successful is Donkey Kong Bonanza really? When the game was first revealed, it was received extremely positively in the main. Finally, Donkey Kong was hitting the big time with a massive game from perhaps Nintendo's premier developers, the Tokyo-based EPD Group 8, with innovative gameplay mechanics, amazing graphics, soaring music, and a prime spot in the launch window of Nintendo's biggest ever console launch. You couldn't really ask for a better treatment for the superstar simian. Reviews were good, early sales were strong, and while the $70 price tag evaded notice in the main because it was not Nintendo's top price at that time, it was still a pricey title, and even more so when they dropped a $20 DLC very soon after launch in the form of Emerald Rush and Donkey Kong Island. Nearly a year on, though, doubts have started to creep in. Bananza remains one of the very few first-party exclusive AAA titles. There's Mario Kart World and Kirby Air Rides in the racing and party space, there's Pacopia, and of course there are smaller titles, cross-gen games, and third-party collabs such as Yoshi, Metroid Prime 4, and Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment. But Bananza remains a unique proposition on the Switch too, meaning that it ought, in theory, to continue to drive a significant amount of sales. The game released early in the July to September 2025 quarter, and so we have 3 sales quarters data to look at. In its first quarter, the game shifted 3.49 million units. During the holiday quarter, it sold a further 760,000. Then, by the end of March, it shifted another 270,000 copies, meaning that it has now sold a total of 4.52 million. Now, to be clear, these are really good numbers. The Switch 2 install base is still small, so this is roughly a 1 in 4 attach rate, and as a proportion of new Switch 2 owners, it seems like in the ballpark of 1 in 10 are picking up the new game in the recent months. If it maintains the same pace as the last quarter, which is traditionally a quiet one anyway, it will leapfrog Donkey Kong Country 2's SNES sales this year and match Wii's Donkey Kong Country Returns in the next couple of years. There are also lots of reasons to think that Bonanza will have further sales windows in which it may make big in the long term, during which we might see more attention, especially if more venues incorporate the Donkey Kong theme park attraction, and particularly if Donkey Kong gets his own movie in the coming years. Also, Nintendo can afford to think of these games as very long-term propositions indeed. A game like Star Fox 64 is on its 4th bite of the cherry. Super Mario Galaxy has just been released for the 3rd time, and of course a rising tide lifts all boats, so if Nintendo is as successful with their long-term Donkey Kong strategy as they hope to be at any point in the coming decades, Bonanza will stand to benefit and drive profits for the company even in the extremely long term. That's the good news, and that's the kind of default position with this property in any event. I certainly don't think that Nintendo are going to disband this new group now that it's formed, and my guess is that this new development group now that it's formed, and my guess is that Kazuya Takahashi is even now developing a new 3D Donkey Kong game to release potentially in the early 2030s, and that Nintendo will continue to back Donkey Kong in a big way. I don't even think Nintendo will be overly concerned about the budget implications at this point either. While it's true that the title was in development for a long time, starting it seems around 2018, the early development was undertaken by the core Odyssey team, with Takahashi brought in as a director in 2020, and the team scaled up progressively over the years that followed. With the game's positioning as a launch window title and the extensive testing requirements for any large game, but especially a technically complex one on such a new system, my assumption is that most of the intensive development period was about 4 or 5 years during the early 2020s. If Nintendo approach things as they often do, a quorum of Donkey Kong developers will keep prototyping concepts for the next title, while a substantial number of the new team pivot to supporting the efforts on the next 3D Mario game, meaning that although the next 3D Donkey Kong could be potentially the better part of a decade away, its active development period would be closer to 3 to 5 years, which isn't all that different from prior games, especially as one assumes they can leverage work on prior titles. Bonanza feels very reminiscent of Odyssey in many structural respects, for example. Plus, having all those extra people to support on the next 3D Mario is something they would have looked to have in any event. But even if we estimated for Bananza a budget of $250 million, including marketing, if a new game matched its predecessor, it would break even in its own right after about a year, and that's before you factor in ancillary sales such as Amiibo. But most significantly to Nintendo, the Nintendo Switch 2 console is also something that people will likely pick up alongside these kinds of high-profile games. Realistically, I suspect Nintendo have quite a lot of efficiencies that keep their costs relatively low due to their long experience, large workforce where they can leverage talent in different ways, and knack of using outsourcing studios, often in low-wage countries, to some effect as well. Because of all this, I don't necessarily think a Bonanza-scale Donkey Kong would need to do even Bonanza's numbers to provide a satisfactory return on investment. I think in reality the game that bears the closest resemblance to Bonanza at this point is Luigi's Mansion 3, another significant project that falls into the broader Mario universe umbrella, although I think in this case Luigi is somewhat outperforming Donkey Kong. Luigi's Mansion 3 released 2.5 years into the life of the Nintendo Switch, at a time when the install base was just over double what the Switch 2's is now, and scooped 6.33 million in its first 5 months on the market, roughly commensurate to Bonanza, but the key with Luigi's Mansion 3 is that it continued selling. 2 years later, it had shifted 11.43 million, suggesting that it was averaging over 600,000 sales per quarter, something Bonanza isn't on track to do. But there again, this includes the pandemic period where the Switch was booming, major new titles were thin on the ground, and Nintendo had plenty of time to promote their past library. By March 2024, Luigi's Mansion 3 had 14.25 million sales, an average still of 350,000 a quarter, with 88% of those sales coming from outside Japan. I think this is the kind of trajectory Nintendo will be hoping for Donkey Kong, but this was always an incredibly lofty goal. If it was a property in its own right, Luigi's Mansion will be in the same ballpark and a little stronger in the case of Luigi's Mansion 3 as Splatoon. Nevertheless, if it can maintain a pace of maybe just under 1 million a year sales, then the likelihood is that Bonanza will cross 10 million sales early next decade. Also, its proportion of sales is 83% non-Japanese, which helps balance out Nintendo's offerings on the new system, which currently have a significant number of games with a strong Japanese appeal compared to a Western one. Kirby Air Riders being a particular case in point, but also Tomodachi Life, very soon Fire Emblem and Splatoon Raiders, and while games which tilt towards the West are still on the system, examples such as Metroid Prime 4 and some degree Age of Imprisonment don't seem to have taken off in quite the same way. All things considered, I'm fairly optimistic that Bonanza will do well for Nintendo, but the difficulty in terms of forecasting is that Nintendo's 1 million threshold for reporting game sales makes it actually fairly unlikely that we will see Bonanza numbers routinely reported, despite the fact that it might be racking up significant numbers just under 1 million year to year. Therefore, I'm going to give just a single forecast at this point at 30%, which is that Donkey Kong Bonanza will top 1 million in sales in a fiscal year prior to March 2029. The most likely way this will happen, of course, is with a film, but even then a different title might be more effective at driving sales. However, what I do think, but which I ultimately think is unlikely to be able to be proved with sales numbers, is that Bonanza will ultimately level out in the region of 8 to 10 million on the system, which would top the dizzy heights of Donkey Kong Country on the Super NES. Now that's it for this video, but thanks for watching as ever, particularly thanks to the Patreon support of this channel. Do check it out for early, ad-free and exclusive content, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.